Everyone thinks they know why the queen wanted Snow White dead. Vanity, a magic mirror. Who's the fairest of them all? A jealous stepmother who couldn't stand to be second best. That's the lie the kingdom told for 100 years. Tonight you get the truth. The mirror never once lied about beauty. It was never asked about beauty at all. And the huntsman who was supposed to cut out her heart, he wasn't showing mercy when he let her live. He was following orders, just not the queen's. Stay till the end, because everyone in this story is lying to someone, including the girl in the glass coffin. Especially her. This is the fairest lie. The mirror had never once told the queen she was beautiful. That was the first lie the kingdom got wrong, and it was the smallest one. Queen Adrienne had inherited the mirror from her own mother, along with a warning she'd never fully understood until the night she needed it. It does not flatter, and it does not comfort. It answers exactly what you ask and nothing more. Be careful what you ask it. For 12 years of her reign, Adrienne never asked it anything at all. She kept it covered in her private chamber, a relic she distrusted more than she used. It was only after the physicians confirmed what the midwife had already whispered, that the birthmark on infant Snow's collarbone, shaped like a shard of glass, matched exactly the mark described in a prophecy scroll older than the kingdom itself, that Adrienne finally uncovered the mirror and asked it the only question that mattered. Is the child the one the prophecy speaks of, the one who brings the crown to ruin? The mirror's answer was not vanity, it was worse. She will be, unless someone teaches her not to be. That single sentence became the architecture of everything that followed, and everything the kingdom would later call cruelty. Adrienne did not act on it immediately. That is another detail history flattened into something simpler than it was. For 4 years, she said nothing to anyone, not her advisors, not her husband before his death, not a single soul in the castle. She watched her daughter grow from infant to toddler to a small, fierce, curious girl who collected beetles in jars and asked impossible questions about why the sky bothered being blue. And every single day of those 4 years, Adrienne told herself the prophecy was wrong, or at least not yet true, or at least not something she needed to act on today. It was a drought that broke her resolve, 3 years of failed harvests, unrest in the eastern provinces, whispered talk of rebellion in taverns her spies reported back faithfully. The kingdom was fraying at exactly the moment the old scroll had predicted it would, and Adrienne, watching her advisors argue in circles while her people went hungry, became convinced that the fraying and the prophecy were the same thread pulling loose. She stopped sleeping. She stopped trusting her own reflection, actual mirrors now, not just the cursed one, because she had started to see her daughter's face superimposed over her own when she looked too long. She was not a woman choosing cruelty easily. She was a woman drowning, grabbing for the only solid thing the drowning ever reach for. Certainty, any certainty, even a monstrous one. Here is where you think you know the shape of this story. Jealous queen, innocent child, a huntsman sent to kill her, a heart brought back in a box as proof. The huntsman's name was Corwin, and he had served the royal family for 11 years, ever since the border wars, ever since a battle where then-Captain Adrienne had pulled him half dead from a collapsed trench and carried him 2 miles on her own back rather than leave him for the enemy to finish. He owed her his life. He did not, however, owe her a child's. When Adrienne summoned him privately and told him what needed to be done, take the girl into the woods, kill her, bring back her heart as proof, Corwin did not immediately refuse. That is the detail nobody tells you, the detail that complicates everything. He considered it. He stood in that room and actually weighed killing an 8-year-old girl, because the woman asking him to do it had saved his life and had never once in 11 years asked him for anything before. What stopped him wasn't mercy exactly. It was a question. Why, he asked her, does it have to be now? She's a child. Whatever this prophecy says she'll become, she isn't it yet. And Adrienne, for the first time in this entire plan, hesitated. Because the honest answer, the one she couldn't say out loud even to a man who'd bled beside her, was that she didn't actually believe an 8-year-old girl was dangerous yet. She believed the prophecy was, and she had spent 12 years terrified that if she waited, if she let herself love this child the way she already, helplessly did, she would lose the nerve to stop the future the mirror had shown her before it was too late to stop it at all. She was not choosing cruelty over love. She was choosing what she believed was the kingdom's survival over her own heart, and telling herself those were different things. Corwin took Snow into the woods. He did not kill her. But, and this is the part every softened version of this story leaves out entirely, he did not spare her out of simple compassion either. He spared her because he had already, quietly, for 2 years, been part of a resistance movement working to end Adrian's increasingly paranoid rule. A rule that had grown harsher every year since the Mirror's prophecy. More soldiers, more surveillance, more fear dressed as protection. Corwin didn't see an innocent child in those woods. He saw a living weapon against the crown he'd begun to believe needed toppling. The girl herself made the decision easier and harder in equal measure. She did not cry, or beg, or do any of the things Corwin had braced himself for on the ride into the woods. She sat very still on the fallen log where he'd told her to wait, swinging her small legs, and asked him whether it would hurt. Whether what would hurt, he said, already knowing, already having that he'd asked. Whatever you're here to do, she said. Mother's guards have been strange around me for weeks. I'm not stupid. I just want to know if it will hurt. Corwin had survived 3 border wars. He had killed men who begged, men who fought, men who simply stared at him in the last second with a kind of exhausted acceptance he'd carried in his own chest for years afterward. None of it had prepared him for an 8-year-old asking, with perfect calm, whether her own death would be painful. He knelt in front of her instead of answering, drew the hunting knife slowly enough that she could see every inch of it catch the light, and said the only true thing he had left in him. No, because it isn't going to happen. But you have to understand something, and you have to understand it exactly the way I say it, or neither of us survives what comes next. He killed a deer instead, brought back its heart in the box exactly as instructed, and told the queen it was done. Then he took Snow, 8 years old, terrified, alone in the woods, believing her own mother had just tried to have her killed, and delivered her not to safety, but to allies. People who saw her not as a girl who needed protecting, but as a symbol who might someday be useful. This is the first twist the old story never gives you. Snow White was never simply rescued. She was recruited. She just didn't know it yet, because she was 8, and grief and gratitude look identical to a child who has nowhere else to go. The 7 who raised her in the mountain settlement were not dwarves guarding treasure out of the goodness of their hearts, the way the old songs claim. They were the remnants of the resistance's founding council, minors, yes, and small in stature, but also strategists, spies, and in 2 cases, former royal guards who had defected after watching Adrian's paranoia turn into policy. Snow grew up in that settlement not as a rescued princess playing house, but as a child raised, deliberately and carefully, by people who needed her to grow into exactly the kind of person the prophecy feared. They were not cruel to her. This is important because it would be easy to make this into a simple story of one set of manipulators replacing another. They loved her, in their way, genuinely, over the 10 years she lived among them. But love and use are not always separate things, and Snow grew up absorbing 2 truths simultaneously without ever quite reconciling them. That these 7 people were the closest thing to family she had left, and that every lesson they taught her, statecraft, combat, the history of the kingdom's grievances against the crown, was preparing her for something. She was 17 before she asked outright what that something was. Bruno, the eldest of the 7, the one who taught her to read using resistance pamphlets instead of storybooks, finally told her the truth on a night when the guilt had clearly been sitting in him too long to hold anymore. There's a prophecy, he said, about a girl with a mark on her collarbone shaped like broken glass. It says she'll either save this kingdom or burn it down, depending on who raises her and what she's taught to want. Your mother believed the second version. We've spent 10 years trying to raise the first. Snow sat with this for a long time. Then she asked the question that none of them had prepared an answer for. And if I don't want to be either version? If I don't want to be a symbol at all? Nobody answered her. Nobody had an answer because in 18 years, nobody in this story, not her mother, not the huntsman, not the 7 who raised her, had once asked Snow what she wanted. They had all simply decided on her behalf which story she was destined to become the ending of. That silence did not sit quietly. 6 months later, when a royal patrol strayed too close to the settlement's outer ridge, likely nothing more than a routine border sweep, 3 soldiers and a scout, no idea what lay beyond the tree line, Bruno gave the order to eliminate them before they could report back. It was standard resistance doctrine, cold and practiced, the kind of decision that had kept the settlement hidden for a decade. Snow refused to let it happen the way he wanted. She rode out ahead of the ambush party alone, unarmed, and talked the patrol into turning back with nothing but a fabricated story about bandits deeper in the pass. A risk that could have exposed the entire settlement in 30 seconds if she'd misjudged a single soldier's suspicion. She returned to a furious Bruno, who told her, in front of the others, that she had gambled everyone's lives on a mercy the resistance couldn't afford. "You gambled 3 strangers' lives on doctrine," Snow said back, and it was the first time in 10 years she had raised her voice at him. "I'm done being taught that killing quietly is the same thing as being safe. If that's what this settlement actually believes, then I don't know what you've spent 10 years raising me to become." It was the first real crack between them, not a betrayal yet, but the first visible fracture in a decade of unquestioned loyalty, and it would matter more than either of them understood in the months that followed. The poisoned apple is real in this story too, but not the way you remember it. Adrian found her not through a hunter, not through evil magic, but the mundane, devastating way most secrets eventually surface. A defector from the resistance, captured and interrogated, revealed the mountain settlement's location under duress. Adrian rode there herself, alone, having spent 10 years believing her daughter's heart sat preserved somewhere as proof of a decision she had never stopped grieving. She did not come to kill Snow. This is the second twist the old songs erase completely. By the time mother and daughter stood face to face again, Adrian no longer believed the prophecy justified what she'd once tried to do. 10 years of ruling alone, 10 years of watching her own fear curdle into the exact tyranny the mirror had warned Snow might become, had taught Adrian something no prophecy ever could, that you cannot prevent someone from becoming a monster by treating them like one before they've had the chance to become anything at all. She came to apologize. She came carrying, absurdly, an apple, not poisoned, just an old habit from Snow's infancy, a piece of fruit from the same orchard tree Adrian used to slice for her as a toddler, the only soft memory she still trusted herself to offer. But the resistance did not know that. Bruno and the others, seeing the Queen approach the settlement after 10 years of careful hiding, made the only decision their decade of preparation had trained them to make. They assumed assassination, and they moved first. It was Bruno's own hand that poisoned the apple, swapped at the last moment, while Adrian waited outside the settlement gates for permission to see her daughter, intending it for the Queen. A preemptive strike, dressed up in 10 years of justified fear. Snow intercepted it. Not out of naivety, she'd been trained too well for that, but because some instinct, some small stubborn hope she hadn't let herself examine in years, told her that if her mother had truly come to kill her, she wouldn't have come alone, unarmed, on foot. She took a bite meant for the woman who'd once tried to have her killed, to save that same woman's life. That is the twist inside the twist, the version of the poisoned apple you've always heard, evil stepmother, innocent victim, was a lie told by neither villain. It was an accident born from 2 sides who had both, independently, decided they understood Snow's story better than Snow did. She did not die. The poison Bruno had prepared was old resistance stock, degraded past lethal strength, strong enough only to send her into a sleep so deep it mimicked death exactly. Glassy skin, no breath fog on a mirror, the whole convincing tableau the old stories describe. They placed her in a glass coffin, exactly as the songs say, though not out of ceremony. It was the only vessel on hand large enough, in a settlement built for hiding, not mourning. And here, finally, is where the story gives you the ending you've been braced for the whole time. A prince, riding through unrelated territory on unrelated business, hears of a girl in a glass coffin, beautiful even in death, and moved by a beauty he cannot explain, kisses her. He was real. His name was Wendell, minor royalty from a neutral territory, And he genuinely did happen upon the settlement, genuinely was struck by the strange sight of a girl preserved behind glass, mourned by 7 armed strategists and a queen who hadn't left the coffin's side in 3 days. He did lean down, he did kiss her. And nothing happened. No gasp of returning breath, no fluttering eyes, no fairy tale magic breaking a curse that was never actually magic to begin with, because it was never a curse. It was poison wearing off on its own biological timeline, slowly, the way real poison does, with or without a stranger's mouth involved. Snow woke 4 hours later, on her own, to find a confused foreign prince still hovering awkwardly nearby, uncertain whether to take credit for something he privately suspected he had nothing to do with. This is the final twist, the one that undoes every version of this story you've ever been told. True love's kiss was never the thing that saved her. It was never even close. What saved her was a body's own stubborn insistence on living, on a timeline that had nothing to do with romance, heroism, or anyone else's story about her at all. The first thing she registered, coming back into her body, was not Wendell's face hovering above her, though he would tell the story for years afterward as though it had been. It was her mother's voice, hoarse from 3 days of grief. Mid-sentence in a conversation Snow had apparently missed the beginning of Adrian arguing, low and furious, with Bruno at the edge of the room, neither of them yet aware she was conscious. And if you had simply let me through the gate, instead of assuming the worst of a woman who rode here alone and unarmed. You have 10 years of reasons why we don't extend the benefit of the doubt to the crown, Adrian. Don't stand in my settlement and pretend otherwise. She is not just a symbol to me, Bruno, whatever she has become to you and your council. Snow lay still a moment longer than she needed to, listening to 2 people who had spent a decade defining her life in opposition to each other finally, for the first time, arguing on the same side of something, her survival, and understanding, with sudden total clarity, that even this, even their grief and their reconciliation, was still somehow not actually about her. It was about who got to have been right. She sat up. The argument stopped instantly, replaced by a silence so complete she could hear the coffin's glass lid settling against stone, where Wendell had propped it open. Snow sat up in that glass coffin. 10 years of being raised as a weapon, 10 years of her mother's guilt, 4 days of being nearly killed by both sides of a war she never asked to inherit, and looked around at every single person who had ever claimed to know what her life was supposed to mean. Her mother hollowed out with 3 days of grief and guilt. Bruno, guilty in a different, more dangerous way, the guilt of someone who still, even now, believed the ends had justified the risk. A stranger prince, still holding her hand, already half in love with the idea of having saved her. I need all of you, Snow said, to understand something right now, while I still have the strength to say it clearly. She looked at her mother first. You spent 10 years afraid of a prophecy instead of getting to know your own daughter. I understand why. I don't fully forgive it yet, but I understand it. She looked at Bruno. You spent 10 years raising me to be useful instead of raising me to be safe. I love you. I also know the difference now, and I didn't before. She looked last at Wendell, still holding her hand with the earnest hope of a man who thought he'd just become part of a love story. She withdrew her hand gently. And you kissed a sleeping stranger because a story told you that's what heroes do, she said, not unkindly. You didn't save me. Nobody in this story saved me. I saved myself eventually, the way I was always eventually going to, whether anyone kissed me or not. Wendell lingered another day before leaving, unsure what role he'd actually played in a story he'd stumbled into halfway through. On his last morning, he found Snow alone by the stables and asked her, with the particular awkwardness of a man realizing he was not the hero he'd assumed, what he was supposed to tell people when he got home. Tell them the truth, Snow said. Tell them you found a girl in a glass coffin and you kissed her because the story you grew up with said that's what you do. Tell them nothing happened because it isn't real, it never was. And tell them she woke up anyway on her own and didn't need you to. That's not a very flattering story for me, Wendell said, and there was no anger in it, just a kind of rueful honesty. No, Snow agreed, but it's the true one. You can decide which one matters more to you. He rode out that afternoon. and true to some quiet decency Snow hadn't expected from him. The story he told when he returned home was, in fact, the honest one, which meant it traveled slower and stranger through the kingdom than the version people wanted to believe. The two accounts existing side by side for years. Most people choosing the fairy tale because it was easier to love than the truth. She left the glass coffin standing empty in that mountain settlement, a strange, deliberate monument. And she did not become the kingdom's savior, and she did not become its ruin either. She became something the prophecy had never accounted for at all, because prophecies, Snow had come to understand, are only ever written by people trying to control an ending in advance, and endings written in advance are the easiest kind to break. She did not take the crown from her mother. She did not join the Resistance's next campaign either. She left both behind gently, but completely, and spent the following years doing the one thing nobody in this story had ever once let her do freely, choosing, slowly and on her own terms, who she actually wanted to become, one ordinary day at a time, with no mirror, no prophecy, and no story insisting it already knew the answer. Queen Adrienne ruled 2 more years before abdicating in favor of a council, Bruno reluctantly among them, built from both sides of a war that had, in the end, cost far more than either side's fear had ever justified. The mirror was smashed, eventually, not by Snow, but by Adrienne herself, on the same night she stepped down. Bruno asked her once, years later, what question she'd have asked it if she'd kept it one more day. "None," Adrienne said. "I finally understood the only honest answer it ever had left to give me. Some things you're not supposed to know in advance. You're just supposed to live long enough to find out." As for Snow herself, the kingdom did eventually get its story. The one that gets sung at festivals and painted onto tavern signs. The one with the jealous queen and the poisoned apple and the prince's kiss that fixes everything. She heard it performed once, years later, at a harvest fair in a town she was passing through under a different name. And she stood at the back of the crowd and listened to a traveling performer sing the whole thing wrong, start to finish, and felt something unexpected settle in her chest instead of anger. Relief, mostly, because the wrong story, sung loud enough, was its own kind of shelter. Nobody in that crowd would ever come looking for the real Snow White, the one who'd learned to fight before she'd learned to trust, the one who'd taken a bite meant for someone else and lived, the one who was, at that very moment, simply a woman at the edge of a fair, humming along to a song about herself that had almost nothing true left in it. She let them have the fairy tale. She kept the truth for herself, the way she'd learned, finally, that she was allowed to. Somewhere in a mountain settlement long since abandoned, an empty glass coffin still stood open to the sky, weather-worn and half-buried in drifting snow, not a monument to a girl who was saved, but to the exact moment she had, once and for all, stopped waiting for anyone else to save her at all. So, who actually saved Snow White in this version? The huntsman didn't, the 7 strategists didn't, the prince definitely didn't, even though he'll probably tell that story for the rest of his life. The only person who saved Snow White was Snow White, eventually, on her own timeline once everyone else stopped deciding it for her. If you saw that ending coming, tell me exactly where which twist tipped you off first. And if you didn't see it coming at all, tell me which one hit hardest. I want to know. This channel exists because I think the stories we grew up with have more hiding underneath them than we were ever told. If you want the next one, and trust me, it's got a twist inside a twist inside a twist, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because you will not want to miss it. I'm Bridget. This has been a different story to tell. See you in the next one.